Support for WUWM podcasts comes from University School of Milwaukee, fulfilling a values-based mission of developing learners, fostering leaders, and preparing citizens for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. More information at usm.org/mission.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today we'll look at the future of the social studies program MKE Roots and what it provides for young people.
When we look at student data, what we see is that civic attitudes are improving and that learning is improving in classrooms where teachers are actively engaged in MKE Roots.
Then we'll learn about a program that's helping tribal schools across the Great Lakes region test for safe drinking water.
It is the organization's goal to expand testing efforts to help ensure safe water quality for tribal youth by testing facilities for PFAS, lead, and other heavy metals.
Plus, we'll look at the history of the Ghost Army, a unit of soldiers in World War II who used fake weapons and other deception to trick the Nazis. All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. Back in September, Lake Effect reported on the sudden cancellation of federal funding for MKE Roots. The program trains Milwaukee area teachers on how to make social studies relevant to students by connecting them to local history. Last month, MKE Roots was notified that it would again receive federal funding. But the money came with the stipulation that the program focus on commemorating the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Melissa Gibson is an associate professor at Marquette University and the faculty director of MKE Roots. She speaks with Lake Effect Sam Woods about the changes to its federal grant funding and how it will and won't change what the program does.
Can you remind us what MKE Roots is and how would you describe its impact?
Yeah, MKE Roots is a project of the Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach at Marquette University that is focused on place-based history and civics education in Milwaukee County classrooms. So based on what educational research has shown and what we know from our years working in classrooms, that students are much more likely to be engaged and to become civic agents and community historians if they understand the context in which they live, their place in the world. And so we are working through teachers to try to improve history and civics education by having an explicit place-based focus. So meaning Milwaukee, what are Milwaukee's stories? Who are Milwaukee's communities? Who are the people in Milwaukee that are making change? And we do that through professional development and direct work with classrooms and building of curricular resources.
We've reported on MKE Roots, I think starting last year and then again about a month ago. But in a nutshell, how would you describe its impact so far?
Sure. So in terms of numbers, we've had 50 teachers who teach at all variety of schools in Milwaukee County, from Vel Phillips Juvenile Justice Center to Rufus King IB, to elementary schools, to suburban schools, to Catholic schools. They serve the full gamut of young people in Milwaukee. And while we don't have an exact number of students that we reach, because it shifts every year in terms of teachers' course loads, it's in the thousands if you're looking at each teacher's load. And what we've seen so far in our data is, one, teachers tell us, 100% of participating teachers tell us that this is high-quality professional development that's changing the way that they think about their teaching. And we have seen that happening in classrooms. You've run stories on some of the teachers and how they are changing the way that they teach, and that in turn is changing the way students learn. A teacher at Marquette High School has entered a partnership with Forest Home Cemetery where students are doing service around grave cleanup and then uncovering stories of Milwaukeeans that are not necessarily known. We have teachers doing living wax museums of Milwaukee change makers. We have students working with artists around the city thinking about art as social activism. And when we look at student data, what we see is that civic attitudes are improving and that learning is improving in classrooms where teachers are actively engaged in MKE Roots.
So as we discussed in a September piece for Lake Effect, the Department of Education canceled funding for MKE Roots and rewrote the grant that was previously funding MKE Roots to prioritize, quote, commemorating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. MKE Roots was invited to reapply for funding under the new priorities. So what happened with that application?
We learned in September that we received funding through the new grant application, so we're very happy that we get to continue offering programming. It will be a slightly revised version. So in this new iteration of Milwaukee Roots programming, we will have an explicit focus or attention on founding documents and principles. But what we said in our application and what we plan to do is put those founding principles in conversation with our local civic context. So how do everyday citizens in Milwaukee bring those democratic principles to life? And how can we learn both from communities of the past in Milwaukee and also contemporary civic actors, and then think with youth about what we want our city to be moving forward? And how does engaging with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the founding debates around federalism and states and all of that, how can that shape the way that we engage here at a local level?
So you mentioned bringing founding principles into the context of Milwaukee. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like?
Sure. I think, one of the most accessible ways to think about that is, we often look at the language from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and we the people and who is included in the we at that time and who is included in the we now. As Sergio Gonzalez, one of our historians, always says, citizenship is really an active struggle over who the we is in the U.S. Whatever you think of the people who wrote the documents and the contradictions in their own lives, they were beautiful poets and philosophers, and they put some lovely words on paper that if we could live up to them, would be pretty astounding. And so how can we use those words, how can we use those ideals that have been imperfectly enacted throughout our history in the U.S., but how might they serve as a guide for us today in terms of what we should still be moving and fighting towards? And I always come back to that question of the we. Who is the we in Milwaukee?
Yeah. Lake Effect favorite, Sergio Gonzalez. That is a banger of a question. Who is the we? And I do want to get back to that, actually, in the context of what we want civic education to look like here in a bit. But bringing back to the application and the fact that MKE Roots did receive funding. But one thing that stood out was previously this grant from the Department of Education had awarded a maximum of 25 programs with funding. This time around, 85 awards were given through this grant. So that's a big jump. That's more than 3 times as many programs that have ever been awarded by this grant. What do you make of that?
Yeah. It's especially interesting because they said they were only going to give out 10 to 15. So I don't know where the money came from. The discontinuations are not enough to fund all 85 projects. It's clear just looking across other government-funded initiatives like the NEA's Big Read that there is a push to really commemorate the sesquicentennial. I imagine that within the Department of Education and within the government overall that they really consider this a signature focus. And so I don't know where the money came from, but certainly they found the funds to keep this a focus. I do also know that they were really, as with the competitive preference priorities, they were really targeting independent civic institutes at institutes of higher education. The way that scoring works on federal education grants is there are outside peer reviewers that score each application and then they just have a cutoff, right? So I wonder if some of those civic institutes which don't have as much experience in teacher preparation scored lower, maybe. And so there was a need to keep finding funds so that they could also engage in the seminars. That would be a hypothesis, but I don't know for sure.
Another kind of nuts and bolts question about federal grant application processes. So previously, this was supposed to be a 3-year grant or 3 years of funding for a project. Is that the same this time around?
Yes.
Okay. And do you receive the money that you're awarded all up front, or do you get it kind of maybe once a year and they can kind of track progress?
Yeah. So typically, the federal government gives you money one fiscal year at a time. And you complete interim reports halfway through each fiscal year and then an end-of-year report. And they use that to determine if you should continue receiving funding. This year, they front-loaded all 3 years of funding I'm assuming for all grantees, but they did do it for us. We are not supposed to use all 3 years during this fiscal year. You're only supposed to use the designated fiscal year funds in the current fiscal year, but they are in our federal account so that we would not go through the process again of finding out if our grant would be discontinued or continued.
You're listening to Lake Effect. I'm Sam Wood speaking with Melissa Gibson about MKE Roots and federal funding. Melissa, we've talked a lot about kind of how federal grant applications work and what MKE Roots is, but I want to talk about the future. So you've received grant funding under an application that had some notable wording change. We mentioned earlier the word commemorate, the semi-quincentennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. What impact does this grant application and its new language have on MKE Roots programming?
Obviously, at the most basic level, the grant's impact is that we are able to continue offering professional development for teachers and to continue partnering with classrooms around the county at the scale that we've been working for the past 2 years. So we're really excited to have the funds to be able to do that. The language around commemoration and the sesquicentennial did force us to rethink a little bit the programming that we offer. We are not changing our ethos. Our focus is still on Milwaukee's communities, particularly those who have been historically and contemporarily marginalized, that are not often included in school curriculum, in Stories of Milwaukee. They're outside the beer barons, right? And our teachers are continually telling us about more communities and groups that we need to think about and include in MKE Roots. And we are, except we've always had a civics focus, but it's been more of an implicit focus. Our theory being that if we can get students to be excited and proud of their city and their communities, that will shape them as community actors. What we're doing now is having a much more explicit focus on civic education and really pulling in traditional civic education around founding principles, documents, government structures, and putting that into our local context and trying to make that meaningful for students. It is important information. It's critical that American citizens understand how the courts work, what rights are guaranteed in the Constitution. These are things that a lot of people don't actually know. So it's critically important information that we're making a more explicit part of our place-based approach.
So earlier you mentioned Sergio Gonzalez, who is involved in the program as a teacher of teachers, and a question that he asks of asking who the we is. Can you talk more about why that kind of question is important when it comes to good civics education?
Yeah. I'm going to start answering that by talking about what civics typically is inside of schools, which is a pretty stale subject that most students are not interested in. In Wisconsin, civics education is measured by having students take the same test that immigrants take to become U.S. citizens. It's a multiple choice test about government facts, structures, people of the past. Typically, students memorize information about the three branches, about checks and balances, about the age that you can run for elected office, and that's civic education. However, most students in schools are under the age of 18. They can't vote, which is often seen as the quintessential act of citizenship. Well, our students can't do that. Many of our students are not U.S. citizens, whether they're documented or not. Many of our students are immigrants. We have a large refugee community here in Milwaukee. Many students are from communities who that quintessential act of citizenship is actively being threatened, whether through repealing the voting elements of the Voting Rights Act, through conversations around, I don't even remember what the name of the bill was. It didn't pass, but there was a bill earlier in this legislative session around changing the rules that would make it harder for women to vote based on like the documentation that you would need to register to vote. In any case, there are many people whose voting rights are actively under threat, and that there is also a history of those voting rights being under threat and being taken away. So even that fundamental act feels inaccessible to many of our students. On top of that, political scientists, theorists, educators would tell you that citizenship is not just about your legal or political citizenship. It's about the web of connection in a community. It's about how we act in public to support one another in our communities, to build a common good, and to bring into reality the world that we want to live in. Government structures are important for understanding that, but that's not the day-to-day work that our young people are engaged in to support their communities, to envision a common good and to work towards that common good. And in fact, a lot of the things that people in Milwaukee lament about our young people, whether it's educational outcomes, involvement with the justice system, or others, I would argue are evidence of young people feeling disconnected from the common good and from the community, that those are not so much social ills as really big warning signs to us, to the rest of the city, that our young people don't feel invested in the version of citizenship and community that we are currently circulating. So a good, meaningful civic education is, yes, going to educate young people in the official principles of legal and political citizenship and the government that oversees our country, our state, our city. But it's also going to help them understand, envision, and act how they are citizens right now, how they are members of communities right now, and how they are powerful agents toward making the world that we want to live in.
Melissa Gibson is an associate professor at Marquette University and the faculty director of MKE Roots. She spoke with Lake Effect Sam Woods. And did you know you can listen to Lake Effect as a podcast? Search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcasts to download and listen on demand. In about 10 minutes, we'll learn about a group of soldiers armed with little more than inflatable weaponry and sound machines who tricked Nazis during World War II. But first, we'll learn about a program that's helping tribal schools across the Great Lakes region test for safe drinking water. That's coming up on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Native American tribes have long faced barriers to clean drinking water and testing. The Great Lakes Intertribal Epidemiology Center is working to change that. They're helping tribal schools and child care centers ensure their water is safe by offering free tests for lead, PFAS, and heavy metals. The program is encouraging schools to take advantage of the free testing to protect kids who are more vulnerable to contamination in drinking water. These contaminants are linked to serious health issues like learning disabilities, certain cancers, and liver or kidney damage. Lena Tran is joined by Jacob Reamer, the project coordinator of the Drinking Water Testing Program.
Tell me about the center's free drinking water testing program. Who's it serving and what are some of the big goals?
Of course. We are the Great Lakes Intertribal Epidemiology Center, also known as GLITEC, because that is kind of a mouthful. And we serve the 34 federally recognized tribes and 4 urban Indian communities across Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Chicago, Illinois, primarily with efforts to improve tribal communities' health through assisting with data needs, partnership, development, community-based research, education, and technical assistance. But for GLITEC's free drinking water testing program specifically, it is the organization's goal to expand testing efforts to help ensure safe water quality for tribal youth by testing facilities for PFAS, lead, and other heavy metals. And we primarily do this through general education, testing efforts, of course, and establishing safe water routine practices. And then, if there are positive results, then we also explore remediation resources if that's necessary.
Can you talk about any health disparities that might be associated with tribal populations and the presence of these contaminants in their drinking water?
Of course. So the health disparities associated with tribal populations and drinking water contamination are just very similar to the health disparities that these communities face in general, such as access to healthcare, poverty, short staffing in the workforce, funding availability, transportation, outdated water infrastructure and piping, and access to testing.
How expensive can these tests be? What's the burden that GLITEC is trying to help alleviate for some of these facilities?
So yeah, for our lead testing efforts, that's funded through the EPA's lead testing in tribal schools and child care centers program as part of the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act, also known as the WIN grant. So that specific funding we use just for lead testing. We wanted to make this program as beneficial and as accessible as possible. So that's where the free testing comes in. And then we wanted to offer that incentive, which can get up to $1,500 per facility, just because currently we don't have any direct funding that we can use for remediation. We're exploring that. Our hope is to get that, but facilities are fortunate to have access to funding from other sources. But with this $1,500 incentive, then that's a good start for, any minor remediation that is needed, some faucet fixtures, some new aerators, things of that sort. It's very easy to want to get your water tested, but when it comes to pricing and things of that sort, it can not be accessible and tough to kind of get scheduled and find the money for it. So for lead testing, I would say that in general, it's probably right around $60 to $80, depending on how many faucets are tested within that facility. Kind of depends on the size of the facility. Sometimes only 3 samples are needed, right? Maybe a couple water fountains and 1 faucet used for cooking and drinking water. Those are what we prioritize, any faucet that's used for drinking or cooking. With PFAS, when we test, we use EPA method 537.1, which tests for 18 different PFAS chemicals. And that price is anywhere from like $380 to about $420. And that's just 1 sample per facility, which is usually all that's needed, because that sample is generally just that water source versus like lead and heavy metals. You want to ensure that you're testing all faucets that are used for drinking and cooking, because sometimes those faucets can be the direct cause of the lead contamination, and those contaminants aren't always found in every faucet.
Can you walk me through what it looks like for a school to participate?
Yeah, so how that works is, we get the funding through the EPA for lead specifically. For PFAS and heavy metals, that's actually separate funding through the Indian Health Service. So we have those funding sources through those organizations, and then we obviously we offer these direct services to facilities and communities for that testing. We're a smaller team, but a number of us have gone through water sampling training. So we actually go out and we do the sampling ourselves, and then we send in the samples to the state lab. They run the tests for us. We get those results back, share them directly with the facility that was tested. Then we begin that process.
What has it been like for you to go into the field and collect those samples? How does that feel? And what's the reaction that you're getting from some of the school administrators when you're doing that work?
I love it. I love face-to-face interaction. I love getting to learn from others, interact with others. I think that's the best part about the job. So it's some early mornings. So when it comes to when it comes to lead testing and the heavy metals, it's beneficial to have at least for the initial results, the first testing, you want the pipes to be unused for about 8 to 18 hours. So therefore, we usually try to get in these facilities before they open. So, a lot of facilities are opening at 7, or staff's coming in at 7, the youth's coming in at 8. So I'm fortunate to be a morning person. I feel bad for the contact person who I have to work with who lets me into the facility.
Because you're showing up at what, like 5 a.m.?
Yep, exactly. So, but it has been really positive feedback. And like I said, these facilities are very passionate about keeping the kids safe and ensuring that they have safe quality water. So it's been good. Even though it's been early mornings, everybody that I've worked with has been excited and letting us in, and has been extremely helpful throughout the whole process.
So what options do schools have for remediation if they decide that that's what they need?
Yeah, so there's definitely different layers and options depending on the results that are found. So initially with our process, if any results come back over the state or federal maximum contaminant level or a public health advisory level, then we work with the facility to make sure that the water source is no longer used until that issue is addressed. So if this is the case, for lead or heavy metals, at least the faucet aerators get cleaned and the water gets flushed, then we do follow-up sampling to see if that's what resolves the issue. And I would say more often than not, that process does resolve the problem. Usually it just comes down to cleaning the filter, cleaning the aerator, which is great. That's very cost effective. It's very easy to do. And that's part of our routine practices is, okay, let's get on a schedule to make sure that these things are done routinely so the water is free from lead and heavy metals. But if that does not fix the problem, then additional testing is needed to kind of discover the source of the contamination, because sometimes remediation may be needed, such as replacing faucets and pipes, or, maybe it has to be explored further into the whole water system. But as far as remediation goes, unfortunately, we can't offer direct remediation assistance, but we are actively working on that and looking into that, and we hope that changes soon. But in the meantime, there is remediation funding assistance that is available for tribes through the state, through the state's DNR, through the Indian Health Service, through other EPA programs, things of that sort.
Are schools required to communicate the results with families, or is it often just something that they'll do on their own?
As far as our program, it is strongly encouraged, and we assist through that whole process right off the bat with our program. That's something that we communicate that it's important to do. Whether it's a requirement on the school's end, I can't answer with certainty, but I do know that we haven't had any issues with that not being done. So schools are happy to communicate those results with the community and parents, and we help with that process as well.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk about the work that y'all are doing.
Thanks, Lena. Appreciate the opportunity.
Jacob Reamer is a public health specialist at the Great Lakes Intertribal Epidemiology Center. He spoke with Lena Tran last spring. During World War II, the Allies used everything at their disposal to defeat the Axis powers, including a lot of trickery. One of the best examples is the Ghost Army units, groups of soldiers armed with little more than inflatable weaponry and sound machines. The work of these units was classified for decades after the war. and former soldiers had to keep their work a secret. Like Al Albrecht, one of the soldiers in the Ghost Army, whose family knew little about his time at war until his work was declassified in the mid-1990s. Before his passing, Albrecht went on to share his story with groups around the nation. Now his story lives on through his daughter, Karen Skibba. She joins me to share more about her father's work. Karen, thank you so much for being here on Lake Effect.
Well, thank you for inviting me. My dad was so proud to have been part of the extraordinary Ghost Army unit, and it's really a privilege to share their story with you today.
Before your dad's work was declassified, because it had been a classified operation, what had he told you about his time in the war?
Well, that's the funny thing. He didn't talk much about it, and there were clues everywhere in our house. We didn't really ask about it, and he didn't talk about it a lot. So it was kind of funny that we didn't know until 50 years later. But we were really shocked to find out that he was part of this special unit called the Ghost Army.
Yeah, so what was that like? Because it seems as though part of why your father probably didn't talk much about it was that it had been classified information, but then, of course, it became declassified.
Right. He wasn't even allowed to tell his wife, so my mom didn't even know about his service. I don't know how he could keep such a good secret for so many years. Yeah, it wasn't until 50 years after the war that it was declassified, and we didn't learn about it until he started organizing these reunions. And then he would tell us, it's for the Ghost Army. I said, well, what is that? And then he would explain what the Ghost Army was, that it was a deception unit meant to mislead the Army, and they used inflatable tanks, sound effects, and other clever tactics that were top secret. And then he started doing presentations at schools and community events, and I helped him with that because I was really good in my field. I'm good with PowerPoint and things like that. So I would go to a lot of his events, and then I would hear about these stories. And I said, this is my dad? I was really surprised at all the things that he did in the Army. And he also then was interviewed for a Ghost Army documentary, and he was interviewed for some books and all of that. And that's when I started to learn more. But he wasn't a person who told us a lot. One time he sat us down for a family presentation, and he gave our family a little slideshow presentation and shared what he all did. And it was really interesting to hear his perspective, and he shared some personal stories.
One of the things I found really interesting in your father's description of how it all worked, I was able to listen to a fair bit of his talk on this, was that they weren't really armed. Here's a clip of your dad, Al, talking about his experience.
Where else did you have a unit that had rubber tanks, rubber trucks, rubber aircraft, and false sound equipment? I think we were very unique, yes. The Ghost Army was very different. We had very few weapons. In fact, I would say not very defensive weapons. But we were mainly combat deception people.
Listening to that, you think to yourself, these were people who were deployed on a battlefield in the middle of a huge-scale war. What were they armed with? What were the tools that they had to fight, really?
Well, as he said, he didn't have a lot of weapons. They had a few guns, but the one thing that he told me that scared me is that they had to keep explosives under the seats of their half-track because in case they were found out, because they were secret, they weren't supposed to be, have all these inflatable things, and people would have found that out. So he was given the orders that if they saw them, they would have to blow up everything. Luckily, that never happened, and obviously he came back from the war. There were 4 men, though, that did die carrying out their missions. And my dad was injured as well because he drove a half-track. He was always the first one who drove because he had really good eyesight. And he hit a tree and he knocked out all his front teeth. But, yeah, they didn't have a lot of weapons. And their goal was to get out of there as fast as they could and not be detected. And that's all they did.
Now, when I was thinking about, what is the purpose of this? It takes you a moment to think, okay, well, I guess maybe you're kind of holding up some of their resources. And then again, I did listen to a bit of what your dad had to say on the subject. This is a bit of a longer clip, but I think worth listening to.
The combat deception was in such a way that it was total, if you can picture that. It had to be sonic. That's what I drove. I drove a half-track. Back of my half-track, I tell my children, was the biggest boombox you ever saw, but it played sounds of tanks and activity. And it was recorded on a wire, and then we would play this to the Germans, probably an artillery position, which was a half mile or a mile away. They would then recognize that there was action, and they would send over an aircraft, a light aircraft. And they would see all these tanks, and from the air, this really looked real. Then they would bombard, fortunately, over us to the 603rd, puncture the rubber tanks, and they had to be repaired continuously. They would be putting together defense, and there we would see tanks and other Army equipment being put together to defend theirself. In the meantime, the real action was taking place someplace else. The real action of our group was surrounding them. And in the meantime, after this was all done, our part of it was all done, and this is the part I liked, that's why we called the Ghost Army, we could deflate all the rubber tanks and disappear. In about 2 hours, we were gone.
Listening to that, you think, okay, all right, that's why they would use this. But I have to imagine being in that situation was so perilous.
It was. He did say, one of his later quotes is, they were scared. They didn't know if they were going to come back alive or not because some of their actions took place only a mile away. Can you imagine that? I just couldn't. I always just told my husband on the way here that I wish I could have been there to see this. I just couldn't imagine them being so close to the enemy and some of the other things that they did. And we're just grateful that he came back. And only, as I mentioned, only 4 men did die. So most of them did come back, so they did obviously a really great job in their deceptions.
One of the things that you've brought in here, or some of the things I should say, are a variety of patches. Of course, your father wasn't, he was in a kind of, I don't want to call it a fake unit, but he was in a unit that I would imagine, being as surreptitious as it was, didn't necessarily have outward symbols. So what do these badges really mean?
Well, they're all fake badges. And this was one of the stories that he told me that I was most surprised about. They would pretend to be officers of different units. So my dad and the other men would sew these patches, and then they would go to the local cafes and bars and, talk it up, pretend that they were going to be going somewhere else. And then there were spies, German spies, that were listening into them. And here, they're going to be going over there. We better go there. So they would be spies. And that, to me, was just amazing. Maybe that's how he got all of his great skills as a salesman, lying. I don't know. But but he was a very persuasive speaker that helped him in his future career as a salesperson. But I'm sure my mom was really surprised because he never used those sewing skills ever again.
How effective was the Ghost Army at really using up the resources of the German army and distracting them away from what was the real intent of the army? How effective were they?
Well, they were extremely effective. They sometimes could actually make themselves look like, they would also join with other groups sometimes. They could make themselves look like there were 40,000 of them when there were only 1,100 of them. So they would use fake blow-up tanks. They would use even fake planes. I even saw pictures of blow-up soldiers. It was amazing. So from the sky, they looked like a real unit, and they did have people attack them. And they had many stories of the Allies that said that they didn't come over to attack us because they were over by you, trying to attack you, and you were able to distract them. And because of that, you saved many American and German lives.
When you think about the legacy of the Ghost Army, what does that look like to you?
Well, my dad's most proud whenever I heard him talk about this is the lives that he saved. It so happens that our heritage is heavily German. So it was really important to him to save lives from the German side, the Allied side. He wanted to save as many lives as possible and not take lives. He never had to shoot or kill anyone. That's what he kept talking to me about the most, is how he was able to save people. In fact, one of the quotes, you might have it there, that was shared in the documentary as war is meant to shoot people and kill people, and we saved people. That's what made me very proud. So to me, that one quote summarizes the legacy of the Ghost Army.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm proud of my dad's service, and thank you so much for sharing that with your listeners.
Karen Skiba is a teaching and learning specialist at UW-Madison. She joined me last year. How we get our recipes today has changed with the prevalence of online resources. But what happens when you're trying to interpret an old cookbook recipe? We'll find out next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. If you're looking for a recipe, chances are you're going to search for one online. But before the rise of the internet, newspapers were a common place to find new recipes featuring the latest ingredients on the market. For two women working at the Wisconsin Historical Society, these old newspaper recipes inspired them to write a cookbook, featuring old recipes and historical anecdotes about how they came to be. Jane Conway and Randy Ramsden are the co-authors of Extra Extra Eat All About It, and they join me to share more. Jane, Randy, thank you both so much for joining us here on Lake Effect.
Thank you for having us.
Tell us a bit about the journey to creating this book. What inspired it?
Well, we were working at the Wisconsin Historical Society digitizing historic newspapers for a online database, and we had to look at all of the pages that we were scanning to make sure that the images were clear. And so you kind of get to know the newspapers you're looking at. And we kept coming across a lot of recipes. And at first it was kind of a game to find the strangest recipes, take notes, and then we would share them with each other. And eventually we said, well, we should really try to cook some of them. And that's how it started. And it was really fun cooking and also doing the research, because there was a lot more research involved than we thought. We thought, oh, let's just cook it. How hard can it be? But then, right, you look into ingredients, or how would they have prepared this dish, or why would they have prepared this dish? So that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, it was just a real natural progression into a book. Truly just a total interest and hobby between both of us that turned into this really fun project.
It's interesting what you say about research, because I myself, I have a number of very old cookbooks, and you'll be reading kind of how they've written things out, and you're like, well, I think I know what they mean, or, it'll be something like sour milk that they'll put in there, and you go, well, what did they mean by that? What level of research did you need to really understand the context of these recipes?
It was truly so much research that we had to do. There was a lot of just assumed knowledge that these newspapers thought that readers had interpreting these recipes that we've just lost by now reading them in 2025. So we really turned to the newspapers themselves to do a lot of our research. If we were wondering what sort of kitchen gadget they might have been using to do a certain part of the recipe, we'd see what advertisements were in the newspapers, what was being sold at the time, what was accessible to Wisconsinites. And we did the same for ingredients as well. We just looked through the newspapers to see what was there. They really were our main source for our research.
That is really interesting. So you went through the newspaper. I mean, I guess that makes sense when you think about it. You go, if you're getting your recipes from the newspaper, you are likely getting some of these other things from the newspapers. What were some of the unusual ingredients that you came across that that really stumped you for a minute, that you went, all right, we're just paging through trying to figure this one out?
Well, there's just like now that some of the brand names have become the name for the ingredient. So there was some research there. We did a French dressing and it called for a French mustard. I'm like, oh, what does that mean? And right, we ended up using Dijon just because we like the flavor of it. But the original may have also meant French's yellow mustard because that was already available at the time. And they like to drop the S's of brand names. The same happened with like German chocolate, right? It was invented by Sam German rather than being a product from Germany. And so that's really kind of the nuance there that we started looking into the newspaper to see like what you would have been able to buy at the store, what was advertised, and kind of go from there.
One of the things that people will notice about these recipes when looking at especially the excerpts of them instead of how you've made them much more like a recipe that we'd see today is how they're written. Today, recipes are very formulaic. They are recipes, but that wasn't always the case back in the day. What would they look like, and what was it like translating that?
I think one of the most infamous recipes for both of us that we worked on translating and interpreting was Hamburg spaghetti, which had this amazingly complicated recipe for a spaghetti dish with meatballs that was not written in chronological order. They would mention ingredients and then mention the amount of the ingredient you needed far down below in the recipe. And it was just such an interesting, challenging, and a fun process to kind of sort it out, get it in chronological order, get the amounts of the ingredients listed at the top. I think there's a lot of like standardization in how we expect recipes to look today that just was not commonplace in the newspapers. And it really varied how they were written. I wouldn't say there was one way that you'd expect. It was just all over the place.
Yeah. And there's a lot of like narrative to it.
Yes. Yeah.
What would you consider some of the more unusual recipes from this book? I will say, for people who read the book, there are many recipes that you're going to find fairly familiar, different takes on a familiar classic, but there are some that are a little more odd.
Like bananas and ham?
That one, yeah. It sounded so strange reading it. We were so intrigued, and it ended up tasting amazing. We loved it. The flavor combination worked so well, but it's just not something you'd ever expect to be making in your modern kitchen.
And that's another example for an ingredient where you just kind of have to do a little bit of interpretation, because bananas, or you don't necessarily know, do they mean the actual like sweet banana, or are they talking about plantains? But then we also found out that at the time, bananas, there were a whole different lot of varieties of bananas that probably tasted differently. We tried out the regular banana you can buy at the supermarket now, and we tried out the plantain. And I for sure thought, oh, they probably meant plantain. That's just, but the sweet banana actually tasted better, so that's what we put in the book.
What would you say are your favorite recipes from the book? The ones that you've maybe incorporated into a meal or two.
I think we always recommend our stuffed onions cooked in a paper bag. It's almost our signature recipe. We love recommending that one. It's a crowd pleaser. I mean, it's onions stuffed with meat, herbs, chopped nuts, and then cooked in this paper bag with butter. So you really can't go wrong with that. And then a personal favorite of mine is our swimming island, which is a hard-boiled egg rolled in cinnamon and sugar, rolled in batter, deep fried, and then served with a hot sweetened wine poured over it. And it's amazing and very dramatic to present to guests. It's just such a fun one to serve.
Just so strange, you got to try it.
It tastes good, though. It really does. It's so unexpected. I think I've never had a Scotch egg before, and I think that might be the most similar to it. So, but it really worked. It's tasty.
So, what would you say is your advice to people who are interested in trying out these kinds of archival recipes for themselves?
Oh, you just got to start. We were intimidated by some of them, but really we did our research first. So we looked at the recipe to really write out the list of ingredients. And then if anything was unclear, then we would do some more research, which can lead you down all kinds of rabbit holes. So that might be hours, right? And then by the time if you still want to cook it that day, that might be a lot. But then, just experiment. And what I found really interesting through this whole process is how much fun it was, and the expectation. Maybe invite some friends to try it together. And this is not the recipe you own, and this is not the best you can do. This is just a fun thing from back in the day, and then you have something to talk about. That's kind of how we approached it. We had our little taste testing group, and so the pressure was really off of us having to cook this awesome meal. We just said, we're trying this recipe, let's have fun with it. And then everybody would taste it and give us feedback, and we would kind of talk about what taste people had back in the day. And so it can be really like a fun community event too.
That was Jane Conway and Randy Ramsden, co-authors of Extra Extra Eat All About It, Culinary Curiosities from Historic Wisconsin Newspapers. We spoke earlier this year. And that wraps up today's show. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Did you know Milwaukee was once home to celery farms? Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll tell you all about them and where they were located in a new Bubbler Talk. Thanks so much for joining us right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.